Nora Whitfield had a system for mornings. She left her apartment on West 54th Street at 7:42. Not 7:40, not 7:45. 7:42 because the bodega on the corner put the fresh coffee out at 7:30, and she needed exactly 12 minutes to walk their order without speaking and be moving again before the neighborhood fully woke up. The coffee was black. The cup was paper. The walk to Holt Rare Books took 9 more minutes if she cut through the alley behind the parking garage 8 if she did not stop to read the headlines on the newspaper stand outside the dry cleaner. She almost always stopped. She had been doing this for 2 years. Since she left Boston with one suitcase, a box of restoration tools, and the quiet that settles into a woman who has decided to stop explaining herself to anyone. New York had been good to her in the way that large, indifferent cities are good to people who need to disappear into movement. Nobody looked at her twice on the subway. Nobody asked why a 25-year-old woman with crooked glasses and a canvas bag that smelled like lemon oil and aged paper arrived at work before the cleaning crew had finished. Nobody asked about Boston or about her father or about the 3 years she spent trying to outrun a man who smiled at her like ownership was a form of love. New York did not ask. New York just moved. Nora moved with it. Holt Rare Books occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on West 47th Street, wedged between a tailor shop and a locksmith. The sign above the door was small, dark green gold lettering. The kind of sign that did not need to announce itself because the people who needed to find it already knew where it was. Margaret Holt had owned it for 31 years. She had known Nora's father, James Whitfield, before Nora was born, back when James was a doctoral student who used to come in and spend his graduate stipend on 17th century pamphlets he could not afford and could not stop buying. Margaret never talked about that, not yet. Nora did not know it yet. What Nora knew was that Margaret Holt was the best employer she had ever had, which was not a high bar, given that her previous employer had been a university archive in Philadelphia run by a department chair who considered coffee a luxury and overtime a character-building exercise. Margaret was 65, white-haired, small-boned, with reading glasses she wore on a beaded chain, and a voice that carried the authority of someone who had spent 3 decades deciding what was worth preserving and what was not. She spoke to Nora the way you speak to someone you have been waiting for without knowing their name. On the morning it happened, Margaret had the light on over the appraisal table when Nora arrived at 7:51. There was a folder already laid out. Dark blue velvet cover, cotton gloves folded inside. Margaret did not look up from the catalog she was reading. "I need you to make a delivery," she said. Nora set her coffee on the edge of the counter and pulled off her coat. "Where the plaza?" There was a pause. Not long enough to be obvious. Just long enough for the cab fare to calculate itself in the back of Nora's mind and come out larger than her preferred Friday afternoon arithmetic. "The buyer does not trust couriers," Margaret continued, still not looking up. "He wants the manuscript hand-delivered. He is on the 14th floor. The concierge has instructions." She finally raised her eyes over the reading glasses. "Take the good gloves. Present the transfer receipt in the envelope inside the folder. Do not let anyone handle the vellum pages without cotton. Understood? And eat something before you go." Margaret returned to her catalog. 5-star hotels have a way of making hungry people feel small. Nora ate half a granola bar over the sink in the back room, changed into the gray blazer she kept on the hook near the restoration bench, and left at 9:15 with the velvet folder pressed flat against her chest and the receipt envelope tucked inside her jacket pocket. The cab smelled of pine air, freshener, and talk radio. Outside, October was doing what October does in New York when it decides to be honest about itself. Gray sky pressing down on the glass towers, leaves going gold and brown in Central Park. The air carrying that combination of cold and exhaust that the city wears like a second skin. Nora watched it slide past the window and thought about the manuscript inside the folder. An 18th century navigation journal. The real thing. Vellum pages, iron gall ink, watermarks consistent with a Dutch paper mill active between 1730 and 1755. She had spent 11 days cataloging it, measuring the foxing, comparing the ink corrosion to her reference samples, writing the provenance notes in her smallest handwriting because she always ran out of space in the margins. 11 days of close, quiet work that required nothing of her except precision and patience. The 2 things she was best at. The cab stopped in front of the plaza at 9:44. The hotel stood at the corner of 5th Avenue and Central Park South, the way it had stood there for more than a century. Pale stone copper roof gone green, with time-red awnings over the entrance, doormen in white gloves who moved with the ceremonial gravity of men who understood that their job was partly practical and partly theatrical, and had made peace with this. Nora paid the driver, adjusted the folder under her arm, and pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose with one knuckle. The left arm of the frame had been bent since a winter 2 years ago in Philadelphia when she had leaned too far over a manuscript table and the glasses had slid off her face and landed on the flagstone floor. She had never taken them to be fixed. There was something about the crookedness she had decided to keep, a small, private stubbornness, a reminder that not everything needed to be corrected just because someone else found it imperfect. She walked through the revolving door. The lobby of the plaza was everything a lobby that has been photographed 10,000 times still manages to be when you walk into it in person. High ceilings, marble floors that threw the sound of footsteps back at you like an echo chamber designed to make everyone aware of their own arrival. A chandelier that caught the gray October light coming through the tall windows and broke it into something warmer. The air smelled of fresh flowers and old wood and the clean that cost money to maintain. Nora walked to the concierge desk, spoke quietly, gave the name on the transfer receipt. The woman behind the desk typed something, smiled and asked her to wait one moment and reach for the phone. That was when she heard the laugh. It came from somewhere behind her and to the left near the corridor that led toward the palm court. She recognized it before she turned, before she consciously identified it. Her body recognized it first the way bodies always do, with sounds they have been trained by experience to treat as warnings. A low, easy, confident laugh. The laugh of a man who found himself genuinely amusing and had never had anyone around him willing to suggest otherwise. Rowan Cross. She did not turn all the way. She turned just enough to confirm with one half-second glance what her body had already told her. He was crossing the lobby from the palm court side, a man in a charcoal suit with his jacket open and one hand in his trouser pocket, talking to someone beside him, laughing at the end of his own sentence. Tall blonde, the kind of handsome that is assembled from money and confidence, in the habit of never being told no. He had not seen her yet. He was 30 meters away. He was moving in her direction. Nora calculated in the 3 seconds she had available. The front door was behind him now. The elevators were to her right past a short corridor. She had the folder in her arms, the receipt in her pocket, the glove still unused. She turned from the concierge desk with a quiet excuse she did not hear herself make and walked toward the elevator corridor. Not fast, just steadily. The way she had learned to walk in the years she had spent learning that speed attracts attention and stillness requires effort, and the most useful thing she could do was move like she had somewhere to be, not like she was running from someone she used to love. The nearest elevator was already open. She stepped in, hit a button, any button. The 7th floor, because it was closest to her thumb, turned to face the doors with the velvet folder pressed hard against her chest, the rectangular weight of the navigation journal solid and real against her sternum. The doors began to close. Hotel elevator doors. They moved the way everything in a hotel like this moved, with a measured, expensive slowness that suggested time inside these walls operated by different rules. She heard Rowan's laugh again. Closer now. The doors were still open. She was looking at the closing gap, counting the centimeters, when she saw the reflection in the mirror panel at the back of the elevator. She had not been paying attention to who was already inside. She had not looked when she stepped in. Her brain had been entirely occupied with the laugh and the corridor and the geometry of distance. But the mirror gave her what her eyes had missed. A man, standing in this back left corner of the elevator, tall, dark-suited, occupying the space with a stillness that was not passive but practiced not the absence of movement, but its deliberate suspension. She could see the line of his jaw in the mirror, the cut of the suit, a watch on his left wrist, heavy, dark-faced. His hands hung at his sides, not in his pockets, not crossed. Just there. Ready. The laugh was in the corridor now. Nora turned. She did not think. Thinking was a luxury that required more time than she had. Her body made the decision before her mind finished framing the question. She took 2 steps back, felt her shoulder blades meet the broad, solid wall of the man's chest, and heard her own voice come out in a low, urgent, slightly desperate whisper that managed to fit 3 words into the space of one breath. Pretend you know me. The man did not answer. He did not have time to answer. And she did not wait for an answer. She turned her face sideways, stood up on the balls of her feet, and pressed her mouth against the angle of his jaw. Awkward, off-center, nothing like the kind of kiss you plan. The kind that happens in the space between decision and consequence. The elevator doors were halfway closed. Rowan Cross stepped into the short corridor. He looked in. What he saw was a woman in a gray blazer, her back to him, her face pressed against the Jewish of a man in a dark suit who had his right arm wrapped around her waist with the calm possessiveness of someone who had done that 1,000 times and expected to do it 1,000 more. The man's chin was lowered toward the woman's hair. His eyes were up, looking straight at Rowan, not with challenge, not with aggression, with the level, unhurried attention of someone who has never needed to announce himself because there has never been anyone in the room who required announcement. Rowan stopped. Something in his posture changed. Something in the shoulders that Nora had spent 3 years learning to read. A small tightening. A recalculation. The kind a man makes when he walks into a room expecting to be the most consequential presence in it and discovers without anyone saying a word that he is not. He raised both hands slightly, palms out. The gesture of a man choosing in that moment not to contest the ground. He smiled the smile Nora knew better than almost any other smile in the world, practiced pleasant revealing nothing, and stepped back into the lobby. The elevator doors closed. The car began to rise. Nora stood with her back to the man and her pulse hammering in her throat and the velvet folder still clutched against her chest like a shield. 1 second passed. 2, 3. The elevator climbed in a silence that cost approximately the same per square foot as everything else in this building. She started to laugh. She did not mean to. It was the release valve on 3 minutes of pure adrenaline. It came out small and breathless and slightly hysterical, the kind of laugh that is not really about anything being funny, but about the body needing to do something with what it has just survived. "I am so sorry," she said to the closed door in front of her, keeping her back to the man. "I do not do this. This is not something I do normally. That man is someone I used to know, and I needed him to stop coming toward me, and I am aware that what I just did was not acceptable behavior, and I will get off at whatever floor this is, and you will never see me again." She tried to step forward, away from him. His arm did not move. Not a grip, not force, something slower and more certain than force. The kind of stillness that says, "I have decided you are here and you will remain here until I have decided otherwise, and the decision is mine to make." She stopped stepping forward. She turned around. She looked at him for the first time properly, the way you look at something when you finally stop reacting to it and start actually seeing it. He was in his early 30s, dark hair cut short close to the head, a jaw that looked like it had been designed with structural rather than aesthetic intent. Eyes the color of dark water, not black, not brown, something in between the color of a lake in November. There was a small scar cutting through his left eyebrow, old white with age. The suit was dark charcoal matte sewn by someone who charged per hour and took their time. The cuff of the shirt showed below the sleeve white precise, with a small embroidered crest so discreet that you would need to have worked with fine fabrics for several years to notice it. Nora had worked with fine fabrics for several years. The man's mouth was not smiling. His face held the expression of someone who has already assessed the situation and arrived at a conclusion and is now simply waiting for events to confirm it. "Your name," he said. Low voice, soft accent, Italian in its bones. "Nora." He waited for the rest. She did not give it. He tilted his head a half degree, not dismissively. The way someone tilts their head when a piece of information arrives in a form they were not expecting and they are deciding what category to place it in. His arms still resting at her waist opened. He removed it slowly, deliberately. The gesture of a man releasing something he has chosen to release, not something that has escaped him. The elevator stopped. The doors opened onto the 7th floor. Wide corridor cream wallpaper floor lamps burning warm in the gray morning light. A man in a dark suit was standing 8 feet from the door. He was 40, perhaps 42, with the kind of face that had seen everything and registered nothing, salt and pepper hair cut close, a build that suggested years of practical use rather than vanity. He had the same small embroidered crest on his cuff. Before Nora could move, the hotel manager appeared from the left end of the corridor, walking fast, his tie slightly crooked, from the haste of whatever he had been doing when someone informed him of the arrival. He was a thin man, mid-50s, and when his eyes found the man standing behind Nora in the elevator, the blood left his face in a single visible tide. Don Ferrante. His hands rose to the middle of his chest and stayed there. I was not informed of your visit. If I had known the arrangements would have been, please accept my sincere. From the far end of the corridor, a room service attendant appeared around the corner, with a breakfast tray, saw what was in front of him, and performed a precise about-face without breaking stride, disappearing through a service door with the tray intact. Nora stood in the elevator doorway and processed the name the way she had learned to process things that arrived suddenly and changed the shape of what she thought she understood. Don Ferrante. She had grown up in Boston, worked 2 summers in the Special Collections Archive at a university in Philadelphia. She had cataloged Italian-language newspapers from the mid-20th century, processed donations from families with long histories and short explanations, read things in the margins of archival documents that were not meant to be read. She knew the name Ferrante the way you know certain names not from news articles or academic journals, but from the texture of things, from the way people spoke around it rather than about it, from the silence that gathered in rooms when it was mentioned. Don. She looked at the man beside her in the velvet folder with the 18th century navigation journal, felt suddenly very small. I have to go, she said. The words came out quieter than she intended. I have a delivery to complete. 4th floor. I will take the stairs. The man who had just been called Don Ferrante turned his head toward the manager and spoke in a voice that had no particular urgency in it, and precisely because of this, was the most authoritative thing Nora had heard in years. The reservation in the Oak Room. Move it to the private dining room on 12. 7 o'clock. Table for 6. He paused, one beat. And Aldo. He said the name without raising his voice, and the salt and pepper man at the end of the corridor looked up from where he had been standing in patience. The Signora's folder comes with me. Aldo crossed the corridor, knelt without being asked, and picked up the velvet folder that Nora had not noticed she had dropped when she stepped out of the elevator. He handled it with the careful, precise movements of a man who had closed more dangerous briefcases than this one, and understood the value of things that looked ordinary. That is my delivery, Nora said. It will be delivered, Dante Ferrante said simply. I am supposed to deliver it personally. You will receive full credit. He said it without irony or impatience, and somehow that was worse than if he had been irritated. The buyer is an associate of mine. It will take 4 minutes. I do not. The man in the lobby. He turned to look at her, then fully for the first time since the elevator, not an assessing look, something more careful than that. He knows you. He saw your face with mine. He has resources. In 2 hours, he will know my name. In 4, he will know what I am doing in New York this week. In 6, someone on his payroll will offer money for information about you. He let the sequence sit for a moment. The service exit leads to the same street where he has people watching the hotel entrance. Nora opened her mouth, closed it. The sequence was logical, irritatingly, uncomfortably logical. She had lived long enough with a man like Rowan Cross to understand the architecture of how someone like that operated, the way he built knowledge into leverage, the way he used information, the way other people use locks. She had run from that architecture for 2 years. She had not run far enough. Walk, Dante Ferrante said. He said it the way he said everything, without emphasis, without edge, as if the word was simply a fact about what was going to happen next. Nora walked. She hated that she walked. She walked. The penthouse was on the 38th floor of a building on 5th Avenue that did not have its address on the door. There was a private elevator that opened directly into the apartment and required a key Aldo produced from his inside jacket pocket without being asked. The rooms were high-ceilinged, quiet, furnished in dark wood and pale stone, and the kind of restraint that announces money more effectively than ostentation. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over Central Park, the trees going gold below the gray sky, the reservoir catching the flat October light. It was the most beautiful apartment Nora had ever stood in. She spent approximately 4 seconds acknowledging this before she started counting exits. 1 elevator key required. A service door at the back of the kitchen, likely leading to a service stairwell. The main stairwell beyond the elevator lobby, accessible if you had the code for the floor. 2 terraces, one off the living room, one off the primary bedroom at the far end of the hall. She marked the distances, noted the cameras in the corridor outside the elevator, estimated the floor's footprint. She was doing this in her notebook, the small brown one she carried in the bottom of her bag, when Aldo appeared in the doorway of the bedroom she had been given. He looked at the notebook. He looked at her. He said nothing. He left. This was the first of what would become a pattern. Aldo appearing observing, departing without comment. She would come to understand a man who measured everything and said only what the measurement required. The first night she did not sleep. She lay on her back in the dark and with her eyes tracing the ceiling and her mind doing the thing it did when she could not turn it off, working through the problem in sequence the way she worked through a damaged manuscript. Methodical without sentiment, she identified what she knew, what she did not know, what she needed to find out. She knew Rowan Cross had been in New York. She knew he had seen her with a man who frightened hotel managers and had soldiers in the corridors. She knew she was in an apartment she had not chosen with a man she did not know who had decided without her input that she would remain here until further notice. What she did not know was why he had said Rowan's full name before she had said it herself. She had not mentioned the last name. She was certain of this. In the elevator, she had said nothing about Rowan at all. In the lobby downstairs, when Dante had outlined the timeline of risk, he had used the full name. Rowan Cross, complete. Both names delivered without hesitation. The kind of precision that does not arrive from guessing. She wrote it in the notebook in the dark by feel. 3 words in the margin of her escape map. He knows Rowan. She underlined it once. She went back to counting exits. Around 3 in the morning, she got up and walked quietly to the bedroom door. She opened it 2 inches. The corridor was dark except for the low ambient light from the city coming through the windows at the far end. Aldo was not in the corridor. She opened the door another inch. She was calculating the distance to the service door when she heard it. Low, steady from somewhere close, the sound of breathing. She stilled. She listened for 3 full seconds. It was coming from her left outside the door close to the wall. Not pacing, sitting. The measured, deliberate breathing of a man who had decided to spend the night in a chair in the hallway outside her room and wanted her to know it without making a production of the fact. She stood in the 2-inch gap and listened. Then she closed the door and went back to bed. In the morning, there was a glass of water outside her door. Next to it, folded into a careful rectangle, a white handkerchief. No initial, no note. Just the presence of someone who had thought in the dark about what she might need. She stood with the glass in her hand for a long time. She told herself it was protocol. She told herself men like Dante Ferrante operated by codes of protection that had nothing to do with her specifically, that the water and the handkerchief were the equivalent of the hotel turning down the bed and leaving mints on the pillow. She told herself this 3 times in the clear internal voice she reserved for things she needed to believe and did not quite. She drank the water. She kept the handkerchief. She did not mention either. On the 3rd day, Dante appeared in the living room at noon and said there was a dinner that evening. Not a question. What kind of dinner, Nora said. Business. He was looking out the window at the park. An alliance meeting with the Hargrove family. It has been scheduled for 6 weeks. I will not postpone it. I do not see what that has to do with me. He turned from the window. He had a quality she had been cataloging without intending to the way she cataloged things that interested her against her better judgment. The quality of being completely still when he chose to be with no nervous energy, no small fidgets, no performance of calm. Just actual calm. The kind that comes not from ease, but from long practice. Rowan Cross was seen at dinner 3 nights ago with Hargrove's son-in-law, he said. The Hargroves do not know this matters. They will. If they see you with me tonight, the association is established. It makes you harder to reach. Nora looked at him. You want me to be scenery, she said. I want you to be safe. He paused 1 beat. The scenery is incidental. She wore the black blazer she found in the closet of the bedroom. Someone had stocked the wardrobe while she was asleep on night 1, dark, practical clothes in her approximate size. Nothing decorative, everything functional. She understood the message before she finished unpacking the 2nd bag. Not be beautiful, be mobile. The restaurant was in the West Village, a private dining room on the 2nd floor of a building that looked from the outside like a normal townhouse and from the inside like somewhere decisions got made that never appeared in newspapers. 2 men stood at the door, 3 more at intervals in the stairwell. Nora counted them the way she counted everything now. The Hargrove matriarch was 62, silver-haired, dressed in the understated way that very old money dresses when it wants you to know it does not need to try. Her name was Constance. She greeted Dante in the way long familiarity looks, not warmly exactly, but without the performance of warmth. Recognition without decoration. She greeted Nora with a look that lasted approximately 3 seconds longer than social convention required, the look of a woman measuring something and not yet announcing her verdict. "What do you do?" Constance asked. Not unkindly. "Manuscript restoration," Nora said. "Holt Rare Books on West 47th. Margaret Holt's shop." "Yes." Something shifted in Constance Hargrove's expression. Not surprise. Not quite. More like a door opening in a room she had not expected to enter tonight. "I know Margaret. 30 years. She restored a 16th century book of hours for my husband's collection in 1998. The water damage on the front gathering." She tilted her head slightly. "Do you work primarily on religious texts?" "Primarily European manuscripts from the 15th through 18th centuries," Nora said. "But I have done devotional texts. Most of the damage you see in early religious manuscripts is iron gall ink corrosion. The acid in the ink eats through the vellum from inside. You cannot reverse it, but you can stabilize it. How?" And then Nora was no longer at a dinner designed to establish the credibility of her presence at a Mafia alliance meeting. She was at a table with someone who was genuinely interested in a problem she knew how to solve, and the part of her brain that only fully woke up in the presence of old damaged things that needed saving took over the way it always did. Completely without apology, with the warmth that comes from talking about something you love, to someone who is actually listening. She talked for 17 minutes about ink, about vellum, about the difference between French paper and Dutch paper, and how you could tell them apart by holding the leaf up to the light and looking at the chain lines. About a 15th century Venetian manuscript she had stabilized over 3 weeks earlier in the year, a devotional text with a rubricated calendar that had suffered serious flood damage, the red ink running into the blue in the opening capital, until you could barely tell what the illumination had been. Constance Hargrove leaned forward across the table. On Nora's left, she felt Dante become very still. Not the stillness of boredom, not the stillness of patience. Full attention without performance. She could feel it in the air at her shoulder like a change in pressure. She did not turn to look at him. Later in the car going back uptown, Dante was quiet for a full avenue and a half. The city moved past the windows, yellow cab lights, and the orange glow of street lamps, and the dark rectangles of closed storefronts. "You knew Margaret Holt before tonight," Nora said. It was not a question, exactly. "Yes, she sent me to the plaza to deliver that manuscript." "Yes. Did you arrange that he was looking out his window at the park?" His profile was very still. "The arrangement was made," he said, "before I was involved. Nora filed this in the same mental folder where she kept the other things she was not yet ready to unfold. The folder was getting full. Upstairs, Aldo wished them good night with the formal courtesy he applied to everything. Dante walked her down the corridor, stopped at the door of her bedroom. She turned. He was looking at her glasses, the crooked ones, the left arm still bent from the fall in Philadelphia 2 years ago. He lifted his right hand, slowly stopped it in the air an inch from the frame. He did not touch it. He withdrew the hand. Something in his face that had been held in a certain configuration for the entire evening, adjusted by a degree she could not name. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. She went in, closed the door, stood with her back against it and her eyes on the ceiling, listening to the building breathe. She did not hear him move. For a long time she heard nothing from the corridor at all. She thought about the way he had looked at the crooked glasses. Not the way Rowan had looked at them, not with the mild contempt Rowan reserved for anything that was not precisely as it should be. The crooked glasses and the second-hand blazer and the paint stain on her left thumbnail that she never fully managed to clean off. Dante had looked at them the way you look at something you recognize, the way you look at something you have already understood. She did not know what to do with that. She wrote it in the notebook anyway. The fourth day and the fifth and the sixth passed in the rhythm of confinement that has its own texture. The view from the window becoming familiar, the distances in the apartment known by the body rather than the mind, the small negotiations of shared space with people you had not chosen to share it with. Aldo brought coffee at 7:30. Dante appeared mid-morning and disappeared by noon. Nora worked at the dining table, which was large enough to spread out the restoration notes she had asked Margaret to courier over, and Margaret had sent them with a card that said simply, "The flu persists, I see. Well, do not smudge the foxing records with your coffee." She smiled for the first time in 4 days. She was measuring the space between Dante's words and his silences. This was the thing about men who spoke rarely. When they did speak, the words carried more weight than they would have from a man who filled every room with sound. And when they did not speak, the silence was thick enough to contain whole sentences. She was becoming fluent in both. On the seventh morning, Nora called Margaret. "I need to come in," she said. "The Ashford Commission is due at the end of the month. The rebinding cannot wait." There was a pause on Margaret's end, the pause of a woman who was many things, including perceptive. "I will have the materials ready," she said. "Come when you can," she told Dante at breakfast. He looked at her across the kitchen counter with the dark water eyes and said, "Aldo goes with you, I know. He stays outside, I know that too." A pause. Something in the kitchen air shifted by a degree. "You will be back by 4. "I will be back by 4, she said. Aldo drove her to West 47th in the black car with the tinted windows. He parked at the curb with the nose pointing at the exit, the car 4 steps from the door, the side mirror adjusted to cover both ends of the street. Nora noticed this. She noticed everything now, the way she had always noticed things, but faster, with more purpose. What she also noticed pulling up to the curb was a second car. Dark blue, parked at the far corner of the cross street. Someone in the driver's seat who did not get out. Someone who was watching the entrance to Holt Rare Books with the patient professional attention of a man who was being paid to watch. She filed it. She went inside. Margaret was at the appraisal table with the Ashford Commission materials laid out and 2 cups of tea already cooling on the side bench. She looked at Nora over her reading glasses with the expression she reserved for students who had passed a test she had not announced. "The flu," Margaret said. "Stubborn variety," Nora said. "So I understand." She handed Nora a magnifying loupe. "The spine on the Ashford Quarto is worse than the photograph suggested. Get started." Nora worked for 3 hours. Her hands found the rhythm before her mind did the careful, methodical rhythm of someone dismantling a damaged thing in order to understand it well enough to save it. She checked thread tension, measured the loss in the hinge, cataloged the condition of each signature. The work required her full attention and gave her in return the peace of total focus. Margaret passed behind her at 2 o'clock and set a fresh cup of tea at her elbow without speaking. At 2:47, she heard the click of the front door. She heard Aldo's voice cut through the glass from outside 3 tones below normal, the register of a man signaling urgency to someone who understood the signal. She turned. 3 men were coming through the door of Holt Rare Books, not browsing, not the posture of people who had come to look at books, the forward movement of people who had come to collect something and had already decided that civility was not going to be part of the transaction. The one in front was large, thick through the shoulders, his coat bulky in the wrong way at the hip. The middle one had his collar up and his face angled down. The third had his right hand already moving inside his jacket. Behind them, through the glass of the door, Nora could see Aldo blocked by a 4th man she had not seen arrive. Her body made the calculation in 1 second, in 2 parts. Part 1, the door was compromised. Part 2, there was a catalog shelf between her and the men. Oak, full, 11 feet tall, 31 years of acquisition. She moved. She hit the shelf with her left shoulder at full force, using her as a weight in the momentum of 2 full steps, and she felt the shelf shudder, and then the physics of a heavy thing finally moving in the direction it had always been leaning. It came down like a tree, comes down, not all at once, but with that gathering, inevitable quality, the sound of wood on wood, and then the massive combined weight of hundreds of cataloged volumes shifting, and then the whole structure meeting the tile floor with a concussion that sent books flying in every direction like a flock of startled birds, the covers slapping open in the air. The front edge of the shelf caught the door. The man with his hand inside his jacket got 1 step in before the weight of the falling catalog stopped the door's swing. She did not wait to see if it held. She turned to run for the back. The second man caught her arm. She pulled against the grip, and it was like pulling against cable, and she was already going through the inventory of what she had in her hands when she felt the fingers grabbing toward her collar, and something in her shifted below logic, below calculation. into the place that had been put there by a father who taught her one specific thing in the last year of his life. If someone gets close enough to grab you, get close enough to bite. She turned her head and bit the back of his wrist. Hard. With everything she had. He roared and let go. She fell. Her left knee hit the tile and she felt it tear, the immediate, bright, specific pain of broken skin on stone. Her glasses flew off her face. The world became shapes and light and motion. But she could hear. She heard the front door open, again hard from outside. Not the careful, measured opening of the original entry. Something different. Something that moved the air in the whole room. She heard two impacts that were not blows, were something cleaner and more deliberate than blows. The sounds a body makes when the force applied to it is professional and efficient and designed to stop function rather than make a point. Footsteps, even ones, crossing the floor without hurry. A hand reached down and picked her glasses up from beside her knee. Set them back on her face carefully, the left arm crooked exactly as it had been. She looked up. Dante Ferrante was crouching in front of her on the tile. His jacket gone, his white shirt open at the collar. His right hand already marked with something she did not want to look at directly. He was looking at her mouth where the corner had caught something and was bleeding a small amount enough to be there. His face held an expression she did not have a previous reference for. Not the anger she would have expected, something that lived in anger's territory but had a different address entirely. Controlled so tightly that the control itself was the most visible thing. Behind him, the two men who had come through the door were on the floor. The third was against the wall near the damaged door frame, sitting with his back against the plaster, his left arm hanging at an angle that arms were not designed to maintain. He was breathing. He would go on breathing. He had been given a very clear message about the cost of being in this building. At the back of the shop, Margaret Holt appeared in the doorway of the storage room where she had locked herself when Nora had shouted the warning before hitting the shelf. She looked at Nora on the floor. She looked at Dante crouching over her. She looked at the books spread across the tile like an exploded archive. She looked at the man against the wall with the broken arm. Then she looked back at Dante Ferrante, and her voice when it came was the voice she used for final verdicts. "Did you bring her here knowing this was possible?" Dante did not answer. His silence was the answer. Margaret looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then she walked to the side bench, picked up the clean cloth she kept for handling vellum, crossed to Nora, and crouched down beside her. "Both hands," she said quietly. "Hold still." She pressed the cloth to Nora's lip. Her fingers were steady. Her eyes, when they found Nora's, held something that was not pity, but was in the same family as compassion. The practical compassion of a woman who had seen enough of the world to know that sometimes survival looks like this, and that looking like this did not make it any less a form of strength. "You pushed the shelf first," Margaret said. "Yes." "Good." She pressed the cloth gently against the corner of Nora's lip. "That was right. That was the right thing to do." Nora looked past Margaret's shoulder. On the floor near the fallen catalog between a 16th century herbal and a Victorian atlas, whose pages had scattered like white leaves across the tile, lay one of the men who had come through the door. His right hand was turned palm up. On his left wrist, where the cuff of his jacket had ridden up in the fall, she could see it clearly. A tattoo. Black ink. A serpent coiled around the wrist, the head resting at the inner pulse point, the tail wrapping back toward the thumb. Nora had seen that tattoo before. Not in person, not on a living man, in a photograph. A 4x6 photograph printed at a drugstore lab on glossy paper, slightly overexposed. Taken through a car window on what must have been a bright day because of the glare on the glass. Her father had taken that photograph. She had found it in the locked cedar box in the bottom of his closet 6 months after he died, when she had finally been able to make herself go through his things. She had looked at it for a long time and not understood what it meant, and eventually she had put it back in the box and locked it and told herself she would understand someday when she was ready. She looked at the tattoo on the unconscious man's wrist. She looked at it and she did not look away. And somewhere in the place inside her, where the list of things she did not yet have answers to, was kept something shifted. Not toward understanding, not yet, but toward the edge of it, the way a shape in fog becomes a tree before you are close enough to see the bark. Her father had taken that photograph in 2014, 10 years ago, in the last month of his life. And the people who wore that tattoo on their wrists had just walked through the door of the building where she worked. Margaret was still talking to her, quietly pressing the cloth to her lip, and Aldo had appeared from somewhere and was speaking in low Italian into his phone, and Dante was standing 2 feet away, watching her face with the patient attention of someone who already knows what you are about to understand and has been waiting. Nora sat on the floor of Holt Rare Books, surrounded by 100 years of fallen catalogs, and looked at the tattoo on the unconscious man's wrist, and felt the first cold edge of a question that was going to require an answer. She did not know yet what the answer was, but she knew with the certainty of a woman who had survived this long by learning to trust the weight of things she did not yet fully understand that the answer was in this building, or it was in the man standing 2 feet away, or it was somewhere between the two. The city did not stop for what had happened at Holt Rare Books. That was the thing about New York that Nora had never fully adjusted to even after 2 years. The city simply continued. The cabs kept moving. The coffee shops stayed open. The man selling roasted chestnuts from his cart on the corner of 6th Avenue did not know or care that 3 men had come through a bookshop door on West 47th with the specific purpose of collecting a woman who had not agreed to be collected, and that the woman had knocked over a century's worth of catalogs rather than wait to see how the situation developed. The city moved. Nora sat in the back of Dante's car with a folded cloth pressed to her lip and her left knee throbbing through the tear in her trousers, and watched the city move and thought about a tattoo. Aldo drove. He drove the way he did everything without commentary with an efficiency so total, it barely registered as a choice. The second car followed 3 lengths behind, always 3 lengths. She had noticed by the end of the first week that there was always a second car. She had stopped noting it as a thing that required recording because it had become simply a fact of the current geography of her life, like the 40-minute patrol intervals and the locked elevator. Dante sat beside her and said nothing for the length of 3 blocks. He was looking out his window at the passing street, his right hand resting flat on his thigh, and she could see in the reflection of the glass the small tension at the line of his jaw that had been there since he walked through the door of the bookshop and had found her on the floor with blood on her lip. She had learned to read that configuration now. It was not anger. It was something that traveled in anger's territory without being anger, and she no longer needed to translate it. She simply knew what it meant. She was done waiting for him to speak first. "How long have you known my name?" she said. Not a question, not exactly. The form of a question without the inflection of one, which is what you say when you are not asking permission, but announcing the territory you intend to cover. He turned from the window. He looked at her in a way she had learned to read over the past week. The way that meant he was deciding not what to say, but how much and in what order, and whether the order mattered for reasons she could not yet see. "Your father's name was James Whitfield," he said. "Boston. He worked in academic research. He died in October 2014. The cloth was still against her lip. She held it there and held his gaze. "You had a file," she said. "I had a name. Those are not the same thing." "No," he said. "They are not." The car turned north. Central Park appeared on their right, the trees dark against the afternoon sky, the last of the day's pale light sitting on the surface of the reservoir through the gaps in the tree line. "Rowan Cross signed his contract with the Caruso family 11 days ago," Dante said. "When that information reached me, your name came with it. Not because of Cross, because of your father." Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back out the window and made herself breathe at the regular pace of someone who was processing information, not reacting to it. She had learned this somewhere around age 15 in the School of Loss, where the curriculum is brutal and the lessons do not repeat themselves. "Tell me the rest," she said. He told her. Not all of it. She could tell even as he spoke that he was giving her the pieces he had already decided to give in the sequence he had decided was safe. But the pieces were enough. The Caruso family had been operating in New York for 26 years, structured as a legitimate import business, with a portfolio of legal entities that had survived 4 federal investigations by being more careful than the investigations gave them credit for. They were not the largest family in the city. They were, however, the most patient. Patient in the way of people who understood that most enemies eventually made mistakes, and that the best strategy was simply to be there when it happened. Rowan Cross had been retained as outside legal counsel. His father, a senior partner at one of the oldest firms in Manhattan, had done work for Caruso-adjacent interests for 15 years, without ever being in the same room with anything provably illegal. The son was carrying the relationship forward with the confidence of a man who understood that the correct application of plausible deniability was essentially an art form. He had identified Nora through her employment at Holt Rare Books. He had identified her as someone worth identifying for reasons that had nothing to do with their 3 years together, which Dante delivered without emphasis and without anything in his face that acknowledged he understood what those 3 years had cost her, and which was somehow the right way to deliver it. The Caruso family has been looking for something since 2014, Dante said. Something your father had. Nora's hand went still against the cloth at her lip. What kind of something? That he said is what we are still establishing. The car pulled up to the building on Fifth Avenue. Aldo came around to open her door. She got out without his help, not out of stubbornness, but because her knee hurt and she needed to manage the pain in the way she preferred, which was quietly and without an audience. Upstairs, Margaret was already there. This surprised Nora. Margaret was sitting in the living room of the penthouse with her coat still on and her hands folded on her knee, and the expression of a woman who had closed the shop, given instructions to the only other employee, and taken a cab across town without being asked, because being asked was not a category she operated in when something needed doing. She stood when Nora came in. She crossed the room and took Nora's face in both hands and looked at her the way mothers look at children who have been hurt. The retrospective assessment. The damage when it is already done look, which is both softer and harder than the fearful one. Sit down, Margaret said. Nora sat. Margaret looked past her at Dante, who had come in behind her and was standing near the door with his jacket still gone from wherever he had left it at the bookshop. Her look lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, it carried everything she had decided on the cab ride uptown and a number of things she had apparently been deciding for considerably longer. The men who came through my door, she said, they will not come back. That is not the question I am building toward. She sat down across from Nora, smoothed her coat over her knees, and looked at Dante with the directness of a 65-year-old woman who had been handling things that required directness for 3 decades and had lost patience with every form of circumvention. Did you know this was a possible consequence of her being at my shop today? Dante was quiet for a beat. Yes, he said. And you let her go anyway. She chose to go. He said it carefully. I chose not to stop her. Those are philosophically different positions, and in practice they amount to the same thing. Margaret looked at him for another 2 seconds. Then she looked back at Nora. Your knee needs attention. There is a first aid kit in the bathroom cabinet, the blue tin. Take care of it now. She paused with the timing she used when she wanted what came next to be heard by everyone in the room. And Mr. Ferrante. She let the name sit the way names sit when they have been known longer than the person being addressed is aware of. When you are ready to have the full conversation rather than the partial one, I will be here. She said it and nothing more. She opened her coat, straightened her reading glasses on their chain, and picked up a copy of a rare books auction catalog that happened to be on the side table. Nora went to the bathroom. She cleaned the gravel from her knee with the focused attention of someone who was using the task as a container for the larger things she was not yet ready to fully unpack. The cut was not deep. It would bruise in a large and impressive color. She knew how bruises worked, how they looked worse 2 days after the damage, how the body's response to injury always lagged the injury itself. She pressed a pad of gauze against it and thought about the tattoo. She came back to the living room and found Aldo standing near the kitchen doorway with his phone in his hand and the expression of a man who had received information in the last 3 minutes and was waiting for the appropriate moment to deliver it. He looked at Nora. He looked at Dante. Something passed between them in the visual shorthand of people who have worked together long enough that full sentences are unnecessary. Dante nodded once. Aldo spoke. The serpent tattoo was documented. Caruso internal. Not broadly known, not the kind of information you found in any database available to anyone outside a very narrow circle of people who had been paying attention for a very long time. It appeared on the left wrist of men who had completed what the Caruso family called an irreversible assignment. It was a mark of initiation into the family's enforcement tier. 11 men in the New York operation carried it, possibly more in their satellite operations in Philadelphia and Boston. It had first appeared in Caruso's organization in 2012. Nora sat very still. The photograph, she said. Aldo looked at her. My father took a photograph, she said. She said it slowly, hearing herself say it, the way you say something you have known at the edges of your understanding for a long time, but are saying out loud for the first time. He had it in a locked box. I found it after he died. A 4x6 photograph shot through a car window, a man with his left hand visible on a steering wheel. The tattoo was visible. I looked at it for a long time and I could not understand what it was or why he had it. The room was quiet. What month? Dante said. I found the box in April 2015. But the photograph, the way the leaves looked on the trees in the background, the light, it was taken in late summer or early fall. I thought maybe August, maybe September. She paused. 2014. 6 weeks before he died, Aldo said. Not cruelly, plainly in the manner of a man delivering the location of a fact. The clock on the wall above the window made its quiet sound. Outside, the park was going dark, the tree line losing its definition against the sky as the afternoon finished itself. Nora looked at Aldo, then she looked at Dante. He saw something, she said. Dante was still standing near the door. He had not moved since Aldo started speaking. He was watching her with the dark water eyes and the controlled expression and the stillness that she had been learning to read. And what she read in it now was not the stillness of someone withholding, but the stillness of someone waiting. Waiting for her to arrive at the shape of it herself, because he had already understood that she was capable of arriving there, and that arriving there yourself is different from being told. There was a Caruso operation in the fall of 2014, he said, on the I-95 corridor outside of Boston. Your father witnessed it. He documented what he saw. That documentation was the reason they came for him. It hit her the way she had always known somewhere that it would hit her if she was ever in a room where someone said it plainly. Not like a blow, like a door opening onto a room you have been standing outside of for 10 years, and the air inside is the same temperature as the air outside, and somehow that is the worst part. The accident was not an accident, she said. No, she had known this. She had known it in the way you know things you cannot prove and cannot bear to examine, and so you put them in a locked cedar box in the back of your own mind and tell yourself that someday when you are ready, you will understand. She had been 25 years old and not ready. She was 25 years old and still not ready. But the tattoo had been on the man's wrist on the floor of Holt Rare Books. And sometimes the world does not wait for you to be ready. She stood up from this chair. She crossed the room and stood at the window looking out at the park below the dark water of the reservoir just visible through the trees. Her hands were at her sides. Her knee hurt. Her lip was swollen at the corner. Her glasses were crooked on her face the way they had always been crooked, and she did not reach up to straighten them. She did not cry. This was not a decision not to cry. It was simply not what happened. What happened was that she stood at the window and felt the weight of what she had just understood settle into her body the way heavy things settle. Not all at once, but in stages, finding their level. The man who had told her the truth was still standing near the door. She was aware of him there, the way you are aware of a fire when your back is turned. Not needing to look at it, to know it is present, to know the temperature, to know its size. Margaret closed the auction catalog. I will see myself out, she said quietly. She stood, buttoned her coat, and paused at the door and looked at Nora's back. Your father, she said, was one of the most decent men I have ever had the privilege of knowing. A pause. I told him the last time I saw him that the best thing he had done in his life was raise you. He agreed with me. Another pause shorter. He was very hard to disagree with. The door opened, the door closed. Nora stood at the window. Behind her, she heard Dante cross the room. He did not come to the window. He stopped a few feet back, giving her the space she had not asked for, and that he had read without being told. She had been noticing this about him for days. The way he read the room, the temperature of people, the distance they needed, without any of them having to say it. Rowan Cross, she said without turning. He came to New York because of my father. Because of something your father had, Dante said. Or something he knew or documented or gave to someone before he died. He was quiet for a moment. We do not yet know what form it takes, but Caruso thinks it still exists. Caruso has been looking for it for 10 years. They do not pay that kind of sustained attention to something that does not exist. She turned from the window. He was standing in the center of the room with the lamplight falling on the left side of his face and the scar through his eyebrow catching the light, the way old scars do a slightly different texture from the surrounding skin. He had a glass of water in his hand that she had not noticed him pick up. He held it out to her. She took it. She drank half of it. She said, "Who was the man on a 95 that Caruso was targeting? The one your father knew? The one connected to everything that came after?" The question landed in the room and stayed there. Dante's face held its configuration for exactly 2 seconds longer than it would have held it for a question with a simple answer. That he said is a longer conversation. "I have time." "I know you do." He was looking at her steadily. "And I will tell you everything. I will tell you all of it." A pause. "Not tonight. Tonight you are hurt, and you have just been told something you have needed to know for 10 years, and I am not going to use that moment to pile more weight on it. What I am going to tell you requires you to be in a condition to hear it clearly." Nora looked at him. The anger was there, the immediate reflex of being managed, of being given the information on someone else's schedule again, in someone else's sequence. She recognized the reflex, and she let herself feel it, and she also, standing there with the half-empty glass of water in her hand, recognized something else. He was not withholding for the reasons men had withheld things from her before. He was not controlling the information to control her. He was giving it shape because he understood that shape mattered. She was beginning, against her own preferences, to understand how he thought. This bothered her more than the withholding. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. She went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and ran the timeline the way she ran difficult restorations backward, from the damage, trying to identify the original structure before the harm was done. Her father had been 44 years old in 2014. A researcher, a careful man, a man who had driven a different way to work every morning since she was small, because he said it kept the mind flexible, and she had thought he was being eccentric. And now she understood that flexibility and caution were sometimes the same thing, wearing different clothes. He had been in the wrong place on the I-95 corridor. He had seen something. He had been careful enough to photograph it and smart enough to know what it meant, but not careful enough, or perhaps not connected enough, not protected enough to survive the knowing. She had been 15 years old, and she had buried him in November in the cemetery on the edge of the town where she had grown up, and a year and a half later, she had buried her mother in the same cemetery 3 rows over, because her mother had kept going for 16 months and then stopped. She had been 17 years old and alone, and she had decided, in the way young people decide things when the alternative is falling apart, that she would be very good at one thing. One carefully chosen thing. She had chosen books. Old, damaged books that needed saving. Precise, patient work that required nothing of her except her full attention, and that gave her in return the only peace she had ever been able to locate with any reliability. Now she was 25 years old in a penthouse on Fifth Avenue, and the men who had killed her father had come through the door of the only place in New York she had ever felt something close to at home. She turned on her side. She thought about Dante's face when she had said the photograph. The exact configuration of his expression in the moment before he absorbed the information and responded to it. Not surprise, something quieter than surprise. The look of someone who has been carrying a piece of a puzzle for a very long time and has just been handed the adjacent piece without expecting it tonight. She had been cataloging these moments, the collected evidence of what he already knew and what he was still learning. The balance was not what she would have preferred it to be. She slept somewhere past midnight. In the morning, she woke before the alarm and lay still for a few minutes, listening to the building's quiet. She had learned the building's sounds the way she learned the sounds of any space she spent time in. The elevator cable, the ventilation cycling, the settling of the structure in the cold. Normal sounds, all of them. She got up, dressed, walked to the kitchen. Dante was already there. This was unusual. He was typically gone by the time she appeared in the mornings, or visible only at the far end of the apartment in the office that overlooked the park. The door 3/4 closed, the low sound of conversation in Italian reaching her as a murmur without content. But this morning he was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee, and beside his cup was a second cup, and the second cup was at the temperature that meant someone had made it in anticipation of her arrival and had timed it correctly. She picked up the cup. She looked at him over the rim. "You watched me order coffee," she said, "at the plaza, before the elevator. You were in the cafe on the ground floor for 11 minutes. You ordered black, no sugar, and you told the barista the cup was too full. The corner of his mouth moved by a precise degree. You were right. It was too full. She drank the coffee. It was right. She put the cup down. She sat on the stool at the kitchen counter and looked at him with the level gaze of a woman who had made a decision overnight and was now implementing it. The man on A95, she said. You told me you would tell me today. He set his cup down. He looked at her for a moment with the considering expression, the one where he was measuring sequence and weight. His name was Enzo Ferrante, he said. The kitchen was quiet. Your father, Nora said. My father. She absorbed this. She set it beside everything else she had absorbed in the last 14 hours and let it find its place in the architecture. The Caruso family had targeted Enzo Ferrante. James Whitfield had been there, had seen it, had documented evidence of the men involved. The Caruso family had then killed James Whitfield to protect that evidence from surfacing, which meant Dante had known for however long he had known about her that the men who killed his father's enemies had also killed her father. How long have you known, she said, about the connection between your father and the Caruso action? He was looking at her steadily. I knew about it before I knew about you specifically. I knew that there had been a civilian witness, that the witness had been eliminated. I knew the name Whitfield was in the Caruso internal record as a resolved problem. His voice held its register on the last two words, giving them no particular inflection, which was itself a kind of acknowledgement. I found you when Aldo flagged your name in Cross's file 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. Yes. You have had 3 weeks. Yes. Nora picked up her coffee cup again. She held it in both hands and thought about this. 3 weeks was a long time, long enough to build a detailed picture, long enough to know where she worked, what she ordered at the cafe, which elevator she would choose in the lobby of a hotel when she needed to disappear quickly. Long enough to have constructed a version of her before the actual version collided with him in the mirrored interior of a Plaza Hotel elevator and asked him to pretend. Were you going to approach me? She said. For the elevator, he was quiet for a beat. I was determining how. And then I came to you, and then you came to me, he said. The morning light was full in the kitchen. Now the October sun finally winning something against the gray coming through the east-facing windows in long, warm rectangles across the stone floor. Nora looked at the light on the floor and thought about what it meant that she had run by accident into the one man in New York who had reasons both professional and personal to keep her from being collected by the people who had killed her father. She thought about what it would have meant if she had run in a different direction, if she had taken the stairs instead of the elevator, if the elevator had already been going up. She did not spend long on this line of thinking. It led nowhere useful. What did they want from him, she said. From my father. What are they still looking for? Dante took a breath. Your father was not only a witness to the I-95 action, he said. He had been keeping something for a period before his death. Something he had accumulated through his research connections and the access that people in academic archives sometimes have without fully understanding what they have. He was choosing the words with care. We believe it is a financial record, a ledger. Caruso transactions from approximately 2012 to 2014. Movement of capital through a series of legitimate entities that, if it surfaces, makes prosecutable what is currently only theoretically prosecutable. My father had a ledger documenting Caruso's finances. We believe so. We believe he was given it or came across it or that it was passed to him for safekeeping by someone who understood what it contained. The Caruso family has been looking for it for 10 years. They have not found it. He looked at her, which means most likely it is still somewhere. And the fact that Cross came to New York with your name in his briefing suggests that he or the people who retained him believe you can lead them to it. Nora sat with this. She thought about the cedar box, the locked one, the one she had found in her father's closet in April 2015. 6 months after he died, when she had finally been able to make herself go through his things. There had been the photograph. There had been a small notebook with handwriting she did not recognize, 3 pages of numbers and abbreviations she had looked at and not understood, and eventually, because she was 17 years old and alone and did not know who to ask, set aside. There had been a spare key she did not know the lock for. There had been a letter in her father's handwriting that began with her name and got no further. The notebook, the numbers. She had not looked at it in 8 years. She had carried the box from Boston to Philadelphia to New York in the bottom of the suitcase because she could not leave it behind. The way you cannot leave behind the things that are heavy with the weight of the person who is gone. She had never opened it again. She set the coffee cup down on the counter with a careful precision that was about controlling the current of what was moving through her. "I need to go to Boston," she said. Dante looked at her. "There are things in my father's storage unit," she said. "Things I have not been through completely. I think there may be something there that matters." He was quiet for 2 full seconds. "Tell me what you are looking for," he said. "I do not know yet." She looked at him directly. "But I will know it when I see it." He nodded. "After the weekend," he said, "I need 2 days to establish what Cross knows about your location. If he has moved his surveillance since yesterday's action, we go differently." She accepted this, not because she had no other options, but because she had begun to understand that his caution was structural rather than personal. The caution of a man who had learned at significant cost what happens when you move before you have accounted for the shape of the obstacle. On the 9th evening, they sat on the terrace. It was too cold for the terrace by October standards, and neither of them mentioned this. The park below was lit from within its own darkness, the pathlights visible through the trees, the sound of the city, 38 floors down, becoming at this height a general ambient presence rather than a specific collection of noises. Nora had her knees pulled to her chest and her coffee in both hands. Dante sat in the other chair with his jacket on and his hands around his own cup and his eyes on the park, way they often were when his mind was somewhere else. "Tell me about your father," she said. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to redirect the way he redirected things that were too close to the center of something. But then he said, "He came here from Sicily when he was 19. He had $40 and a cousin's address in Brooklyn and the confidence that belongs to men who do not know enough yet to be afraid." A pause. He built everything himself. Over 30 years. Not all of it clean. But everything that mattered he built with his own hands. Was he good to you? Dante looked at the park. "He was everything to me," he said, which is different from being good to you in the way that word normally means. He was not a gentle man. He was a hard man who was capable of tenderness in the specific situations where he decided it was allowed. Another pause. "He showed me things. How to see a room before you walked into it. How to know who was the most dangerous person at a table without looking directly at any of them. How to be patient. He said patience was the only real advantage a man could give himself." He stopped. "He sounds like someone worth missing," Nora said. Dante was quiet. "He made a promise," Dante said slowly, "before he died. A promise I inherited. I have been." He stopped. The sentence did not finish itself. "You have been keeping it," Nora said. He looked at her. He did not say yes. He did not say no. What his face did was more complicated than either, and she filed it in the notebook, the way she filed everything without forcing the meaning, trusting that the meaning would clarify in time. 3 days later, on the 12th morning, Dante came to the living room while she was working on the Ashford Commission notes, which she had spread across the coffee table, with the systematic untidiness of someone who was organized in ways that looked chaotic from the outside. He had a book in his hand. He set it on the edge of the table beside her papers. She looked at it. She recognized the binding before she read the title the way she always recognized bindings first. The weave of the cloth, the quality of the impression, the slight warp of age along the spine. The cover was greenish-gray cloth, the title blocked in gold that had faded to a warm bronze. Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass. She looked at the copyright page. 1855. The first edition. The actual first edition printed in Brooklyn in July of that year. 600 pages, the first book Whitman had set some of the type for himself. There were perhaps a few hundred copies known to survive. She had held one once in the archive at Penn and been too moved by it to speak for a full minute. She looked up at Dante. He was standing with his hands in his trouser pockets and his expression arranged in the configuration that meant he had made a decision and was now observing its effect. "This is not an apology," he said. "It is a book. It is a first edition of Leaves of Grass. You mentioned the 1855 printing once, at the Hargrove dinner, to Constance." A pause. "You said the Brooklyn print shop paper had a different chain line density than the later editions, that you could tell them apart by touch." He paused. "You were correct." Nora looked at the book. She looked at him. She picked it up with both hands. The weight was right. The texture of the cloth was right. The roughness of 170-year-old binding cloth that had survived its century by being stored correctly. She opened the cover carefully the way she opened every old book, taking the weight evenly. The paper had the cream color of age that was not damaged, the good kind of age, the kind that comes from time rather than neglect. The first poem opened with the lines she could have recited from memory. I celebrate myself and sing myself. She turned the pages slowly. Around page 40, she felt the slight resistance that sometimes means a repair, a tipped-in page, a later edition. She reached the source of the resistance. A photograph tucked into the gutter between the pages. Small, slightly glossy, the kind of photograph made from a developed negative rather than a digital print. She pulled it out. She looked at it. The girl in the photograph was 16 years old. She was standing in front of a house in Boston, the gray-painted house on Ellery Street, where Nora had grown up, the front steps with the cracked third riser that her father had always meant to fix the window, to the left of the door with the blue curtain visible at the edge. The girl was wearing a school sweatshirt and had her hair back and her glasses slightly crooked on her face, and was smiling at someone behind the camera with the open smile of someone who did not know they were being photographed or did not mind. Nora recognized the smile. She had not worn it in a long time. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in a small, precise, slightly old-fashioned handwriting that was not Dante's handwriting in Italian, il debito inizia qui, proteggila. She did not speak Italian with any fluency, but she had spent 7 years working with Italian language manuscripts, and she had handled enough correspondence in Italian to read handwriting reasonably well. And she sat on the couch in the penthouse on Fifth Avenue with a 1855 Leaves of Grass in her lap and a photograph of herself at 16 in her hands, and translated the 7 words on the back slowly, word by careful word. The debt begins here. Protect her. She sat very still. She turned the photograph back over and looked at the girl in front of the house. The photograph had been taken in 2015. She knew this because of the sweatshirt. It was the one from her junior year of high school, the year after her father died, the year before her mother died, the hardest year of 3 hard years. She had worn that sweatshirt almost every day for 8 months because it had been in the back of her father's closet and it had smelled like him for the first few weeks, and she had not been able to stop wearing it once it started. Someone had taken this photograph of her in 2015 from the sidewalk in front of her house. Someone she had never seen. Someone who had then placed it inside a book and written a sentence on the back of it. She looked up at Dante. He was standing in the same place he had been standing when she took the book. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. The expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is standing at the place where he is going to have to set it down, and the setting down is not a relief but a reckoning. She held up the photograph. She held it between 2 fingers facing him. She said, "Whose handwriting is this?" The question sat in the air of the apartment between them, in the October light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, in the quiet that the building maintained at this height above the city, in the space between what she had known when she woke up this morning and what she knew now in the 10 years of a locked box and a photograph she had looked at once and not understood. Dante looked at the photograph in her hand. He looked at her face. He pulled his hands slowly from his pockets. He sat down in the chair across from her, the chair he had never sat in before in her presence, always standing, always with one exit in peripheral vision, always the man who was upright when other people were seated. He sat down. He sat down and he looked at her, and what was in his face was the thing she had been unable to read on the balcony when he had talked about his father and the unfinished sentence. The thing she had filed as too complicated for the notation system she had available. She could read it now. It was the face of a man who has spent 6 years keeping a promise he did not entirely understand how to keep, and has just come to the moment when keeping it requires him to give up the last thing he was holding back. The handwriting was small and precise and slightly old-fashioned, in the way that European handwriting from a certain generation tends to be old-fashioned, formed by someone who had learned to write before the age when speed became more important than shape, someone for whom the making of each letter was still a considered act. Nora held the photograph between 2 fingers and waited. Dante sat across from her in the chair he had never sat in before, and he looked at the photograph in her hand with the expression of a man arriving at the end of a long piece of patience. "My father," he said. The two words took up no more space than two words require, and yet they rearranged the furniture of the room. Nora looked at the photograph, at the girl in the sweatshirt in front of the house on Ellery Street, at the handwriting on the back. She turned it over and read the 7 words again, not because she had forgotten them, but because she was giving herself the time she needed before she asked the next question. "He photographed me," she said. "He had someone photograph you." "Yes," Dante held her gaze, "not to watch you in the way you were thinking. To confirm you were there, that you were safe, that you had someone around you." A pause. "He checked on you 3 times after your father died. Once in the winter of 2015, once in the spring of 2016, once in October of that year, 6 weeks before your mother died." Nora sat with this. The October of 2016 she remembered with the clarity of periods you survive rather than live through. The last 6 weeks of her mother's life, which had moved with the terrible slowness of things that are ending and refuse to hurry. She had been 18 years old. She had made soup every evening and sat at the kitchen table and read aloud from whatever book was on the counter, because her mother had stopped being able to hold a book, but had not stopped being able to listen. She had been in those 6 weeks almost entirely alone. Almost. He never made contact, she said. No, he felt he had no right to make contact. Your father saved his life. Your father died because of it. He could not. Dante stopped. He pressed his hands together, the fingers interlaced, and looked at them for a moment. He could not walk to your door and introduce himself as the man whose life cost you your father. He could only be certain you were not additionally in danger because of it. He could only be certain you had what you needed. He could not give me back my father, Nora said. No. So he watched from a distance and wrote a sentence on the back of a photograph. Dante looked at her with the dark water eyes and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. And she had come to understand a man who knew the difference between the silence that is avoidance and the silence that is respect. She put the photograph down on top of the open pages of the Leaves of Grass. She looked at it lying there, the 16-year-old girl in the gray-painted front yard of the house where she had grown up, the cracked third stair in the background, the curtain in the window, the sweatshirt that had smelled like her father until it did not anymore. Tell me what happened on the I-95, she said. All of it, from the beginning, he told her. It was November of 2014, a Tuesday late afternoon, the kind of November afternoon that lowers the sky so that the gray presses down on the highway and the headlights come on at 4 o'clock, even though night is still an hour away. Enzo Ferrante had been driving from New York to Boston for a legitimate meeting, one of the real estate development negotiations that made up the public-facing half of the Ferrante operation, the half that paid taxes and employed lawyers and generated the paperwork that made the other half difficult to reach. He was in his own car. He had one man with him. Caruso had found out about the trip 3 days before through a source inside the Ferrante operation that Dante had not identified until 18 months later. They used 2 vehicles. They came up behind Enzo's car on the I-95 and forced it off the road at a section of the highway where the shoulder narrowed and the guardrail ran along a steep embankment. Enzo's car went through the guardrail. It rolled twice and came to rest on its side against a concrete drainage structure 40 feet below the highway. The car caught fire. Enzo's man was unconscious. Enzo himself had a broken collarbone and a head wound and was unable to get the door open. The car that had passed the point of the forced exit before the Caruso vehicle stopped was driven by a 44-year-old researcher from Boston named James Whitfield, who had come down to New York for a departmental conference and was driving back. He saw the car go through the guardrail. He stopped. He went down the embankment on foot into the dark, with the fire starting at the engine, and pulled 2 men out of a burning car that he had no reason to approach and every reason to stay away from. The Caruso vehicles had stopped on the shoulder above. The men in those vehicles watched James Whitfield pull Enzo Ferrante and his man out of the car. They watched his face. They read his license plate. They did not come down the embankment. Enzo was conscious and armed, and even with a broken collarbone was not someone you approached without significant preparation. They drove away. They filed the license plate. They gave James Whitfield 1 week before determining that the risk he represented was too significant to ignore. On a Tuesday morning, 8 days later, James Whitfield's car crossed the center line on Route 2 outside of Arlington and struck a concrete median barrier at 60 miles per hour. The accident investigation found no mechanical failure. The road conditions were dry. There were no witnesses. The official finding was driver error. Enzo Ferrante was told what had happened 2 days after that. He had been in the hospital with the broken collarbone and the head wound, unable to act, unable even to fully understand in the first days what James Whitfield had been to him. A stranger, a complete stranger, a man with no connection to the family and no reason to help and every reason to keep driving. When Enzo understood, he made a promise. He made it in the manner of men who grew up in a tradition of blood oaths, which is to say he made it without witnesses and without ceremony and without any expectation that the world would acknowledge it, because the weight of such promises does not come from acknowledgement, but from the man who carries them. He promised that the Whitfield family would be safe. He promised that the woman responsible for whatever James Whitfield's death had cost the wife who died 2 years later, the daughter who was left alone would have protection, whether she knew it or not, whether she wanted it or not, for as long as the Ferrante name meant anything. Enzo died of a heart attack in March of 2018. He left the promise to Dante the way he left everything. Not with formal instruction, but with the weight of something that had been important to him for a long time and that he trusted his son to carry without requiring explanation. Dante had been 28 years old and had just become the head of a family operation and had inherited among its considerable obligations an unsigned debt to a woman in Boston he had never met. Nora listened to all of this without interrupting. The apartment held the sound of the story the way certain rooms hold sound, absorbing it into the walls, the floors, the accumulated density of everything that had happened within them. Outside the windows, New York continued its operations. Below the park lay in its October arrangement of gold and brown and the deep green of the paths. When Dante finished, she did not speak for a long time. She was doing what she did with things that were too large to process quickly, holding them still the way you hold a damaged page up to the light before you decide where to begin. The inscription, she said finally, the debt begins here. He kept the photograph because he needed to remember where it started, Dante said, not as a threat, as a marker, the beginning of the account. He paused. Debts in my family are kept very carefully. The ones we owe as much as the ones owed to us. And you, Nora said, you have been keeping this account for 6 years, yes, without telling me it existed. You did not know it existed. Telling you would have meant telling you your father was killed, which you had been told was an accident. It would have meant telling you why he was killed, which would have put you in more danger than you were in. It would have meant, he stopped. He looked at his hands again. The brief downward glance that she had come to understand was not weakness, but the opposite. The gesture of a man who was being precise about something because the imprecise version was not acceptable to him. It would have meant introducing myself as the reason you grew up without a father. Nora looked at him. The anger she had expected to feel was there, but it was not the largest thing in the room. It was present, a real and legitimate anger, about 10 years of not knowing about the locked cedar box and the numbered notebook and the letter that had begun with her name and gotten no further about being 17 and alone and not understanding why. The anger was real. But beside it taking up more of the available space was something that she did not have a clean name for. The sensation of an architecture that had seemed random or broken or left incomplete, suddenly revealing that it was none of these things, that it had been built to a plan she had not been able to see because she did not have the whole drawing. Her father had stopped on a highway in the dark because a car had gone through a guardrail and there were people inside. He had not known who the people were. He had not known what world they came from. He had known only that there were people in a burning car and that he was the person who had stopped. This was not random. This was completely consistent with every version of her father she had ever known. She could hear his voice in it in the way she could still hear his voice in certain kinds of decisions. The ones that did not require deliberation because the answer was already built into the person making them. He had pulled 2 men out of a burning car and it had cost him everything. And the man whose life he had saved had spent the last years of his own life trying to honor that. And the man's son had spent 6 years after that carrying what his father could not finish. She picked up the photograph. She looked at the handwriting on the back one more time. The small, precise, old-fashioned letters. "Your father was a good man," she said. Dante was quiet for a long moment. "He was complicated," he said. "He was also a good man. Those things were true at the same time." He paused. "Your father was uncomplicated. He was simply good. That kind is rarer." Nora set the photograph down on the page. She stood up. She stood at the window for a moment, giving herself the vertical space and the view and the cold light coming off the glass. Then she turned around. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "The cedar box," she said. "The one I told you about. The one I found after my father died." There was a notebook inside. His handwriting on the cover, numbers and abbreviations inside that I could not read. 3 pages. I was 17. I did not know what I was looking at, and I did not know who to ask, and I put it back, and I have carried the box from city to city for 8 years because I could not leave it behind. She looked at him. "I think I know what is in it now." He looked at her steadily. "The Caruso ledger," he said, "not the ledger itself. I do not think my father had the actual ledger, but I think he had a record of what he had seen. Names, numbers, something he documented because he was a researcher, and documenting things was how he processed what he knew." She paused. "And I think the person who gave it to him, or the person who knew what he had documented, might be someone I know." Dante was very still. "Margaret," he said, "not a question." "She said at the hospital that she had known my father before I was born. She said he used to come into the shop." Nora looked at him. "She sent me to the plaza to make that delivery. She knew you were the buyer. She knew I would be in that lobby on that morning." She held his gaze. "She has been waiting for something. I need to know if she has been waiting for me." Dante stood. He reached for his phone. "I will have Aldo." "No." Nora said it clearly. "I am going to see her alone." He looked at her. "I will take a cab," she said. "I will be back in 2 hours. Margaret is not a danger to me. She is the opposite of a danger to me, and I think you know that." A pause. "Whatever she has been carrying it for me. Not for you. She will give it to me because I ask, not because someone arrives with protection." She looked at him evenly. "Let me go alone." The silence lasted 4 seconds. "I will know where you are," he said. "I know you will." She put on her coat. She took her bag. She rode the private elevator down and walked out through the building's side entrance onto 64th Street, where the October air hit her face with the honesty of cold air in a city that strips everything down to what it actually is. She walked. She did not take a cab. She needed the blocks, the pavement, the movement of her own feet carrying her toward what was coming. 14 blocks south, 2 blocks west. She had walked this route every morning for 2 years, and she walked it now in the middle of the afternoon with the low sun cutting sharp shadows between the buildings and the trees along the park's edge, going the deep gold of the last days before they let go. She pushed open the door of Holt Rare Books. The catalog shelf was gone. The space where it had stood was clean. The floor swept the divot in the tile from the impact marked with a small temporary barrier. The smell of the shop was the same as it had always been, glue and old paper and the faint astringency of cleaning solvent. Margaret was at the appraisal table. She looked up when Nora came in. She looked at her face, and she looked at her hands, and she looked at the way she was standing, and whatever she read in all 3 of those things made her set down the loupe she was holding and take her reading glasses off the chain and fold them and set them on the table beside the loupe. "Sit down," she said. "I would rather stand." "Then stand." Margaret folded her hands on the table. "Tell me what you have come to ask." "My father gave you something," Honora said, "before he died. Something he needed someone to keep. Someone he trusted more than anyone else." Margaret was quiet. "He came to see me in September of 2014, she said. 6 weeks before he died, he had not been to the shop in almost 2 years, and he walked in without calling ahead, which was not like him. James was always considerate about calling ahead, and when I saw his face, I knew that something had happened that was outside the category of things I was going to be able to help with in the ordinary way." She looked at her hands on the table. "He sat in the chair by the window, the one you always use, and he told me what he had seen on the I-95. He told me about the car, the men, the tattoo he had photographed. He told me about the notebook he had put together from things he had been able to research afterward. The entities, the account numbers, the names, what he believed it all added up to. He had more than the photograph, Nora said. He had a great deal more than the photograph. Margaret looked up at her. He had 3 pages in the notebook and a separate document typed 11 pages that represented 6 weeks of the most careful research I had ever seen anyone do outside of a professional investigation. Names of entities, financial flows, a pattern that with the right context could be made prosecutable. She paused. He was a researcher, Nora. It was what he was built to do. He found something, and he documented it with the same rigor he brought to everything. He gave it to you, Nora said. He gave it to me because he trusted me and because he understood that giving it to the police or the FBI directly without protection would simply make him a target faster. He needed to give it to someone who could hold it until the right moment arrived. She looked at Nora with the direct, steady gaze of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has been doing so without complaint, because complaint was never the point. He also gave it to me because I told him to. Because I told him that I had been quietly cooperating with a federal agent for 11 years, giving him information that passed through this shop or the circles around it. I told him that I knew how to hold evidence safely and for as long as it needed to be held. The information arrived and Nora absorbed it in stages. Margaret Holt, 65 years old, short white hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and a voice that carried the authority of 3 decades of knowing what was worth preserving. A federal cooperator for 11 years, now 21, using the invisibility of a rare books dealer who moved among old money and new power, and the families that funded both to pass information to people who could use it. He trusted you, Nora said. He knew me for 22 years. He trusted me with the most important thing he had. Margaret's voice was even, and I have kept it for 10 years because I understood that the moment had to be right and that the right moment would not be determined by me, but by the person James would have wanted to make that determination. Me, Nora said. You, Margaret said. You were 17 when he died. You were 19 when your mother died. I watched you pack your life into a car and leave Boston, and I watched you come back to New York, and I watched you build something here in this shop out of patience and precision and a kind of determination that your father would have recognized immediately because it came directly from him. She paused. I was waiting for you to be ready. Not safe. Ready. Another pause. And then you walked into the lobby of the Plaza Hotel and ran into the one man in this city who had been waiting to find you for 6 years. And I understood that the moment had come. You arranged the delivery, Nora said. The buyer was real. The delivery was real. I simply made sure it was you who made it on that morning at that hour. She looked at Nora with the expression that was not apology and was not quite certainty, and was somewhere between them in the territory occupied by people who have made difficult decisions for reasons they believe were right and are prepared to stand behind them, but are not foolish enough to call them easy. I am sorry for the manner of it. I am not sorry for the outcome. Nora stood in the middle of the shop that smelled of glue and old paper and thought about her father sitting in the chair by the window in September 2014 and telling Margaret what he had seen on the highway and what he had built from the research afterward, and Margaret telling him to give it to her, and James Whitfield, careful and precise and constitutionally incapable of keeping driving, when a car went through a guardrail, agreeing because he had no better option, and because he trusted the woman across from him, and then driving home and living for 6 more weeks and dying on a dry road on a clear morning. She pulled a chair from behind the counter and sat down. She sat in the chair that Margaret had said was the one she always used, and she looked at the clean floor where the catalog shelf had stood, and she breathed for a minute. The document, she said. Where is it? Margaret stood. She went to the back room. She was gone for 90 seconds. She came back with a flat archival box, the kind used for storing documents that need to be kept in controlled conditions, acid-free, sealed at the edges with preservation tape that had been replaced at intervals. She set it on the table in front of Nora. She sat back down. She looked at Nora across the table. Your father gave this to me and told me that the only person who had the right to decide what happened to it was his daughter. He said she would come when she was ready and she would know what to do. She paused. He was very hard to disagree with. Nora looked at the box. She looked at the preservation tape at the edges, which had been replaced carefully over 10 years. The adhesion maintained the integrity of the seal preserved with the same attention Margaret brought to every document in her care. 10 years of attention, 10 years of waiting, a document that could have been handed over at any point that had instead been kept until the person it belonged to was ready to receive it. She put her hands on the box. I know what I want to do with it, she said. Margaret looked at her. I want to give it to the FBI directly, not through an intermediary and not through Dante Ferrante, and not as part of any arrangement that benefits any family or any operation or any position of power. I want to walk it to the federal building, and I want to put it in the hands of whoever it needs to be in the hands of, and I want Rowan Cross arrested, and I want the Caruso family prosecuted, and I want it to be done because my father spent 6 weeks documenting what he saw and died for it, and I am going to do with that documentation what he intended it to do when he built it. The shop was quiet. Margaret looked at her for a long time. Agent Pruitt retired last year, she said, but his successor, a woman named Dana Voss, has been managing several of the same investigations for 4 years. She knows what your father's name is attached to. She has been waiting for the missing piece. You have her number, Nora said. I have her direct line. Margaret paused. I will call her now if you are ready. Nora put her hand flat on the archival box. I am ready, she said. What happened in the following 48 hours happened with the efficiency that attends actions that have been prepared over a long time and require only the final act to trigger the sequence. Dana Voss met Nora at a building on Varick Street that was not the main federal building, but a quieter address with a conference room on the 3rd floor where 3 people were already waiting who had clearly been waiting for longer than the 40 minutes since the call. Nora sat across a table from federal investigators for 2 hours and gave them the archival box in the notebook from her father's cedar box in Boston, which Dante had sent a car for that afternoon without being asked, and she answered the questions that were put to her with the precise factual clarity that comes from growing up with a researcher for a father and having learned early that the most important thing about information is its accuracy. She did not call Dante before the meeting. She called him after. She was standing outside the building on Varick Street with the cold evening air coming off the Hudson 2 blocks west, the sky going the deep blue of a New York October evening, when the lights come on in the buildings and the city shifts into its night configuration. He answered on the second ring. It is done, she said. A pause. Are you all right, he said. Yes. She looked at the buildings across the street, the windows lit in their warm rectangles. I gave them the document. My father's notes. Everything. She paused. They are moving on Cross tonight. Caruso will take longer, but they have what they need. He did not say anything for a moment. Good, he said, and the word carried something in it that was not simple approval, but the sound of a weight that had been in place for a long time, completing its purpose and going still. Rowan Cross was arrested the following morning at 7:41 as he walked into his firm's building on Park Avenue. Aldo told her, not with satisfaction. Aldo did not perform satisfaction. He told her the way he told her everything as a plain fact about the state of the world. She put her coffee cup down. She stood in the kitchen of the penthouse for 30 seconds and let it be true. Her father had built the case that ended it. She had delivered it. That sequence was complete. She thought about her father. She thought about the dry road in October and the decision he had made when a car went through a guardrail and everything that decision had cost, and the document he had spent 6 weeks building from what he had seen, and the way he had given it to the only person he trusted to hold it until the right time. She thought about him sitting in the chair by Margaret's window and having the presence of mind in the middle of his own fear to organize what he knew into a form that could outlast him. She understood standing in the kitchen with her coffee that her father had known what was coming for him. Not the specifics perhaps, but the general shape. He had been careful enough and smart enough to know that the people whose faces he had seen were not people who left witnesses. He had had 6 weeks to prepare, and he had used every one of them. He had taken care of it. She had finished it. She put the coffee cup down. She went to the window. Dante came into the kitchen a few minutes later. She heard him, the quiet sound of his footsteps she had learned to distinguish from Aldo Thone by the second week without consciously trying to. She heard the coffee being poured. She heard the familiar small sounds of mourning, which had become, without her noticing the exact moment of the transition, familiar in the way that things become familiar when you have shared space with someone long enough that their movements are part of the ambient architecture of your day. She did not turn immediately. She gave herself the time of looking at the park, at the joggers on the path below, at the light on the reservoir. She gave herself the time of understanding that she had come to the end of the chapter of her life that had been organized around a locked cedar box, around the not knowing that had been the shape of her grief for 10 years. What came next was a different kind of life. She did not know its precise shape yet, but she was, for the first time in as long as she could remember, curious about it rather than afraid of it. She turned. Dante was standing at the counter with his cup, his jacket on the early light from the east window on the left side of his face. He was looking at her with the steady attention he gave things he was trying to understand rather than simply observe. She crossed the kitchen. She sat on the high stool at the counter across from him. She reached across the counter and picked up his coffee and drank from it. He looked at this. He looked at her. He said nothing. He went to the cabinet and got a second cup and poured it and set it in front of her. The correct temperature, the right amount of milk. She picked up the new cup. My father had a photograph of him and my mother somewhere, she said. One he always kept in his wallet. She is laughing. He is looking at her instead of the camera. She looked at the cup. I never found it. After he died, I went through all his thing and I never found it. Dante set his cup down. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He took out his wallet. He opened it and removed a photograph and set it on the counter between them. It was a 4x6 photograph, printed on glossy paper, the edges worn soft from years of handling. A man standing outside somewhere on a bright day, mid-40s, with a woman who was laughing at something just outside the frame. The man was looking at the woman instead of the camera. His face held the expression of someone watching a thing they love do what they love most. Nora knew that face. She had not seen it in 10 years, not in a photograph, not in anything she could hold in her hands, because she had not been able to look at photographs for a long time. But she knew it immediately, the way you know things that were part of the original structure of how you understood the world. Her father was laughing slightly himself, not at the camera, at her mother laughing. She picked the photograph up. She held it in both hands carefully, the way she held old things. Not because it was fragile, but because it deserved the same attention. She gave everything that was worth preserving. Your father kept it, she said. He carried it with him from 2015 until he died. Dante's voice was quiet. He said it was the face of a man who understood what mattered, that he kept it to remember what honoring a debt looked like. He paused. I kept it after him, for the same reason. Nora looked at the photograph for a long time. She looked at her father's face, at the expression of a man who has turned away from the camera to look at something better. At the worn edges of the photograph, the soft corners, the small crease at the lower right, from years of being folded into a wallet and unfolded again by the hands of two men in sequence across 10 years. He would have liked you, she said. My father. She turned the photograph slightly in the light. He liked people who showed up when it was inconvenient. He had a very low tolerance for people who only arrived when the cost was manageable. Dante was quiet. I think he would have found me alarming, he said. He found alarming people very interesting, she said. He spent most of his career researching things other people found too complicated or too dangerous to look at directly. She set the photograph down gently on the counter. It runs in the family. Outside New York was doing what it did on October mornings when the air was clear and the park still held its color. Being briefly before the day fully arrived, the thing it occasionally permitted itself to be, which was beautiful without qualification. That evening, Nora went to bed and turned off the hallway light. Not as a decision exactly, not as a ceremony. It was simply the thing she did at the end of that day, in the natural sequence of moving through the apartment toward the bedroom. And when she reached the switch, her hand went to it and turned it, and that was all. She lay in the dark and thought about her father. Not the loss of him, but the shape of him. The man who stopped on a highway because stopping was the only option he could live with. She recognized the instinct. She had always had it. She simply had not known until now where it came from. She had slept with this hallway light on since the autumn she was 15 years old, in the days after her father died, when the dark had become the container for everything she could not manage in the light. She had carried the habit with her the way she had carried the cedar box, not because she could not set it down, but because setting it down had required her to arrive somewhere first, to reach a point at which the dark was once again simply the dark and not the shape of everything she had lost. She had arrived. In the morning, she woke before the alarm. She lay still for a moment in the gray light coming through the curtains in the quiet of the apartment before it began its day. Then she got up, put on her glasses, the left arm still crooked, and went to the kitchen. Dante was already at the counter. Aldo was at the far end with the newspaper and the small economy of expression that was simply his natural face. The morning light came through the east windows in its flat October way, honest light, the kind that does not flatter anything, but makes everything clear. 2 cups were already on the counter. The correct temperature, the right amount of milk. She sat on the stool. She picked up the cup. She held it in both hands and felt the warmth of it and looked at the photograph still lying on the counter where she had left it the night before her father's face turned toward the laugh that was just outside the frame. Dante was looking at her. The scar through his left eyebrow caught the morning light. She thought about a man she had run into in an elevator 14 days ago. A man whose father had kept a promise for 4 years and whose son had carried it for 6 more. A man who had stood outside her bedroom door in the dark and waited without asking for anything in return. A man who had set a 170-year-old book on the edge of a table and not called it what it was. She reached across the counter and straightened the photograph so it was parallel to the edge of the counter. Her father looked at her mother laughing. The hallway light was still off. It stayed off.